Okay. Welcome to this webinar. This is the second of two webinars on supporting learners who use English as an additional language through the school transition progress. The first webinar on this topic, which the Bell Foundation hosted last July, introduced new guidance on how to support learners using English as an additional language through school transitions and presented very interesting case studies of good practice. So if you would like to watch a recording of that webinar, Lizzie will now post a link on the chat show, but chat box, hello, but we will post it again at the end of today's webinar, so don't worry. Today, we are going to focus specifically on the linguistic challenges of the transition to secondary school. Our first speaker, Professor Alice Dignan, will summarize the findings from her research on the linguistic challenges of the transition from primary to secondary school. And then our second speaker, Sarah Moody, will discuss the implications of these findings for supporting multilingual EAL learners through this transition as they learn both English and through the medium of English. Before I introduce today's speakers, let me just briefly tell you the structure of this webinar. So first, Alice will speak for about 30 minutes and Sarah for about 15. And after that, they will take any questions that you may have. Feel free throughout the webinar to use the Q&A panel. So don't wait until Q&A time to pose or send any questions. Just type them as they come to you and I will collect them and post them to Alice and Sarah during question time. Tomorrow you will receive an email from us with a link to access the video recording of this webinar. Enough of me now. It gives me great pleasure to introduce today's speakers, Professor Alice Dignan and Sarah Moody. Alice is Professor of Applied Linguistics at the University of Leeds School of Education. She's a researcher and teacher in Applied Linguistics and has worked as a teacher of English and a teacher educator in various countries in Europe and Asia. She has worked as a lexicographer and author for Collins Cobuild and is on the editorial boards of the journals Metaphor and Symbol, Annual Review of Cognitive Linguistics, and Metaphor and the Social World. Her current research project uses corpus linguistic techniques to explore and describe the language of early secondary school in the UK in collaboration with educational professionals in schools in the north of England. Sarah Moody joined the Bell Foundation as a trainer in 2021. She has over 30 years of experience in a range of settings, including language schools, secondary schools, local education authorities, and a UK university, and has been a mainstream English and drama teacher. Sarah has an MA in Applied Linguistics and ESOL-focused PGCE secondary and 2 postgraduate diplomas. She's the author of the Bell Foundation's guidance document on how to support learners using EAL through school transition. So over to you, Alice.
Thank you. Right, I'll share my screen. Okay, I hope everybody can see my screen.
Perfect,
okay.
Perfect, Alice.
Thank you. So thank you for the introduction, Silvana, and thank you everybody for coming along to this webinar. I'm going to talk about some research that I've been doing over the last 4 or 5 years. I've worked with 13 schools in the north of England, led by Huntington School, York, and I couldn't have done the research without them. So it's very much a collaboration here between academia and schools. As we know, the reason that you've chosen to attend is we're very aware of the challenges of the transition. Different environments, new challenges, new language, new difficulties. And I became really interested in this idea of new language. We know that a poor transition is associated with negative outcomes. There's been research that showed that. So in Scotland, research found, following 2,000 school students from age 11 to 19, that a poor transition predicted lower attainment and lower well-being than peers. And the effect was still detectable, although it was reduced at age 18 to 19, so long after the participants had left school. And we know that the people who struggle are the students whose reading is below the expected levels at the end of primary school. They're statistically likely to fall further behind at the transition point, having a less than 1 in 10 chance of getting 5 good GCSEs. So we know that it's a real issue. Now, my area is language, and I started out actually as a TEFL teacher and TESOL, and then I worked in EAL. So I've always had that focus on language, and I became really interested in the language aspects of the transition, because what I felt that I was seeing was a change from a kind of generic language of primary school, which is much more like everyday language, moving towards this very specialist disciplinary language that the Education Endowment Foundation, among others, have described as students requiring disciplinary literacy. On this slide, I've put a quotation here from Brown and Driver, who were science specialists, who pointed out some time ago that teaching environments and teachers' language are very different in secondary schools from primary schools. On the right of the slide, I've got 2 excerpts from science from year 6 and year 7. From the materials that we gathered a couple of years ago. Now, I've asked academic colleagues, which one do you think's primary and which one do you think's secondary? That's colleagues at the University of Leeds. And their first reaction is the one below is primary. But of course, it's not. The reason they've said, I think that's primary material, is because of the colour, the picture, and so on. But in fact, it's vastly more difficult, as I'm sure you can see. The text above about fossils is written very much in a narrative style, so it's a genre that primary school children will be very familiar. It's written like a story, essentially. It's about fossils, it's the story of the people who discovered fossils. The person who wrote that had predicted that there would be a couple of unknown words there, fossils and geologists. And the way they wrote that text was so that they were explaining the words in the rest of the text. So by the time you get as far as the word fossils, which is highlighted in blue, and geologists in the next paragraph, again highlighted in blue, there's a very clear explanation in the rest of the text about what that is. And it's very much focused on people's actions. So it would be a very familiar genre to students. Now, those children, just a couple of months later, doing year 7 science, are faced with this kind of text from a Key Stage 3 science book, where there's a massive amount of unknown vocabulary. And as we can see, a diagrams that are not necessarily particularly helpful, because without explanation, it's not particularly clear what they mean. And a lot of the new words are explained with other words which are themselves difficult. And importantly, if we look at what the focus of the sentence is, it's not people as such. It's not people who we might see in the everyday world doing actions. It's very much abstract and unknown things that are the focus there. So we became interested in this language challenge, and my project was to try and identify what the different language is. So we had a large project, which, as I said, involved teachers and involved teacher trainers at Leeds as well, and involved linguists who helped us with the software that we needed for that. So I won't explain in detail what we did, the actual methodology of the project. That's written about elsewhere, and if you're interested, there's lots of stuff available online about it. I'm going to explain the key findings briefly. So in year 7, students experience a very sharp step up in the volume of language in both absolute terms and in its range and its specialist nature. So I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. There's a good deal of new vocabulary, and there are some specialist grammar structures. And thirdly, which I think is really interesting as well, is that the goals of each discipline or school subject tend to have evolved in a way that doesn't always seem to be articulated to students. So there's an increase in volume of language and in its range. And then there's a new kind of language as well. And then there are these new goals. So those combine to make a bit of a perfect storm for students who are facing other challenges at the same time. So what we did, we compared language data from years 5 and 6. So we gathered from those 2 years, and then we gathered language data from years 7 and 8. We had 8 primary schools and 5 secondary schools who took part. Before we even began, we asked the teachers on the project for advice about what sort of materials we should gather. So we said to the teachers, okay, I want to get reading and listening material that's typical of the student experience these years. What should we gather? And they said, you need PowerPoints, you need textbooks, you need lesson recordings, you need assessment material, and so on. So following their advice, we then went to schools, and schools provided us with that and allowed us to record lessons. We recorded 175 lessons altogether. Teachers were incredibly generous with what they gave us. So we found, as I said, there's actually a lot more language, which might sound weird, but there's more of it in year 7. And we don't have detailed calculations for that because we didn't calculate in that way. But what we found was that across all subjects, PowerPoints and textbooks are more densely written. So a PowerPoint at secondary school often might look not that different to the one I'm showing you, maybe slightly less densely written, but certainly a lot more densely written than in primary school. And another generic difference, which has also been found in research, is that teachers tend to speak for a higher proportion of lesson time in secondary school. There's no judgment attached to this. Our job is to go in and describe. Teachers make the decisions as are appropriate to their classrooms and to their curriculum goals, and they have a huge amount of material to get through, which probably accounts for some of this. So there was a lot more language, which just in itself is going to be tiring. It's going to use up mental processing space. And then we found there are many new words. For example, there's more than 1,000 new words in science at Key Stage 3. One previous researcher writing about science said that students encounter more new words in their science lessons than in their modern foreign language classes. So we used computer software to compare the data to see which words are more frequent across the 2 phases. Okay, so I'm going to show you some of the examples. There's a lot more of this information in a book that we wrote about this, which is available open access. So using some of the software that we now have available, we compared science lessons in years 7 and 8 with years 5 and 6, and the software enabled us to pull out words that were significantly more frequent in Key Stage 2 than Key Stage 3 than Key Stage 2. And I've put some examples of those here in order of how much more frequent they were. Where it says N, V, adj, and so on, it's like noun, verb, adjective form, of course, because force can be a verb as well as a noun. Okay, so this was the kind of thing that we started with, and then we drilled down to get examples to see what that meant. So here's examples of some Key Stage 3 words that don't occur at all in our Key Stage 2 data. So we had a long list. These are just a few examples of them. On the left are the words, and on the right are the kind of sentences that they occurred in. And here are some words from our Key Stage 2 data that don't occur in Key Stage 3. And you can see a really different focus here between years 5 and 6 and 7 and 8, just from that sort of sample of the words. There's lots about the animal kingdom. There's a bit about basic science methodology, and there's kind of everyday kind of words, creepy, toe, and so on. Okay. We then split the science words. We had to look at what sorts of words we got. And this is a bit like the idea of tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3, but for science specifically. So we found some everyday language, we found generic science language, and we found specialized science words. In Key Stage 2, we found that a lot of the words that are associated with the national curriculum topics are also fairly similar to everyday words. And these were the kind of words that we got that were associated with the national curriculum topics at Key Stage 2. Key Stage 3, words associated, so tier 3 words associated with national curriculum topics. There was stuff from physics, chemistry, biology, words for the elements and so on that you would expect to find in Key Stage 3. And then what I thought was really interesting is this tier 2 stuff, the generic science vocabulary. So this is the kind of vocabulary that we found at Key Stage 2 that is very much generic. Materials change, shape, heat, important changes. And I think that we can see that while that vocabulary is associated with science, it doesn't seem too inaccessible. It's got an everyday quality to it, although obviously it is something to do with science there. So that's the Key Stage 2 generic science vocabulary. Key Stage 3 science vocabulary is a bit of a different story, though. We've got concepts like mass, speed. The use of store is actually very different from the everyday use that students might be familiar with, because it was all to do with storing energy, which is a concept that's quite abstract, in fact. So the generic science vocabulary there, much more specialized. And this is where our computer software was really useful, because it enabled us to pull that out from the data that we'd gathered from the schools. But what was really interesting for me, because I'm fascinated by different meanings of words. As Silvana said, I have worked as a lexicographer. I worked on learners' dictionaries, and part of that job is splitting up different meanings of words. The technical term for multiple meanings is polysemy. And there is absolutely stacks of it in Key Stage 3 science. There's so much multiple meaning. It's been noticed before, of course, especially in school science. So Fang's noticed it, and more recently, Alex Quigley of the EEF, he's noticed it as well. And these are some examples from their research material. Fishes that swim in schools, rocks move on a fault, a measure of liquid volume. So I'd seen these examples and I thought, yeah, okay, so we get some polysemy. I wonder how frequent it is. It was absolutely everywhere. And children struggle with it. These are interviews with children around the transition. So some of our schools, we interviewed the children. We interviewed them in year 6, and then we interviewed them again in year 7. And these interviews are from the beginning of year 7. both these excerpts are from the same interview. And the interviewer, who was my colleague, asked the students, what did you find hard in science? And Ellie here, obviously the names are changed, said, well, we learned about a cell wall and a high concentration and a low concentration. And they went on and explained to us that they found this really difficult because the meaning of concentration that they were familiar with was thinking hard. So when people talked about concentration in sciencey terms, they didn't know what it meant. And then she carried on and said, this one time, this question was really hard for us all because we have this word, it was significant. And John said, yeah, significance. And now, oh yeah, like I get it, I know what it means. And then the researcher says, mm-hmm. And John said, and I can do the questions. The researcher said, so what does it mean? And John said, it means a special number, I think. He was actually talking about maths and science there. And we went back and looked at his maths lessons because we'd actually got a recording of the teacher teaching maths and the word coming up there. Now, the context that word occurred in maths was that the teacher had asked the children to round numbers up to 3 significant figures. So it's actually a very specialist meaning of significant. John thinks it means a special number. So he's almost certainly not able to do the questions, even though he thinks he can. When we looked in everyday language, because we've got a huge database of everyday language that we can study to do comparisons, we found that a common use of significant in everyday language is with significant birthday. So I guessed, I'm not sure about this, but I guessed that John's mother or father had had a significant birthday recently and they talked about special numbers. Now, as adults, we can see the connections between those meanings easily. And it's all too easy to think that that's a very obvious connection that makes sense. But then as teachers, we always know that once you know something, it looks obvious with hindsight. And these meanings aren't obvious. The meanings of cell, wall, concentration, significance, and so on. The scientific meanings are not obvious from the everyday meanings, and certainly they're not specific enough. Sometimes children have been encouraged to guess from context, which obviously is a great strategy generally and really encourages autonomy. But sometimes these scientific meanings are just so specialised that guessing from context is unlikely to get you there by itself. This is a slightly overwhelming slide, but it's just many, many more examples of stuff where the everyday meaning is a bit different from the science meaning. So you've got pressure. The meaning that children are most likely to be familiar with is psychological pressure, but that literal meaning is the meaning that's usually used in science, the physical meaning. And the two at the bottom I really like as well, solid and image. The meaning of image that's most common in everyday language these days is the idea of your sort of social presentation of self. And the meaning that is used in science, a visual image, is much less common. So it's quite possible that children would be much less familiar with that meaning. So there's a huge number of these words. Okay, just a bit about maths then, and then I'll say something briefly about English. Similar findings for maths, and I've put acknowledgement to my colleague Doigu, who also did the interviews, because she did a lot of the work on this. Learning maths actually can't be separated from learning the language of maths. Although we sometimes think of maths as being equations and its own language, in fact, school maths, researchers have shown, can't be done without understanding the language of it. And it's some ways, it's almost like a foreign language. the data has shown that the negative effects of transition to secondary school are more significant for maths than for any other subject. It seems to be the one that statistically students dip at the most. What we found looking at differences in word use in Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3, there were a lot of concrete words in Key Stage 2 versus abstract in Key Stage 3. And on the slide, I've put a very typical kind of problem from Key Stage 2, very much expressed in concrete terms. In Key Stage 3, maths words tend to be much more abstract and they're less likely to refer to everyday ideas. And again, you get this multiple meaning, polysemy, in Key Stage 3 maths. Words like expression, solution, term, they do sometimes occur in Key Stage 2, but they're much, much more frequent in Key Stage 3. Some of our colleagues working with school maths said that some of the actual maths itself is not necessarily more difficult in Year 7, but the way it's expressed has moved completely from everyday to abstract. And as I said before, we're not criticising that. We're not saying that shouldn't happen. It's an inevitable part of the of moving up the education system. But it may be something whose challenges aren't that well understood. So some new features at Key Stage 3 in terms of grammar then. The subject of the sentence tends to be more abstract. So Key Stage 3 science, friction is a contact force. Whereas Key Stage 2 science, Thomas Edison invented the light, it's a person. The passive voice is more common at Key Stage 3 as well. And even for native speakers of English, even in our first language, many children at that age have not completely mastered passive. So for EAL children, it's likely to be doubly challenging. A feature of Key Stage 3 as well is large and complex noun groups. So naturally, the section of the river near the mouth is affected. So a great long noun group there. And sometimes this is much more difficult than the verbs, in fact. Many of the nouns are abstract as well in Key Stage 3. Moving on to English then, and this was my third point about a change in disciplinary goals here. Words that are more frequent and significant in secondary school English compared to primary school English, these didn't necessarily look like very, very difficult words, but categorized them. And we found that the words that were most frequent at secondary school English were words that talk about writers' intentions and the craft of writing. So it was about what the writer wants to do, why they're doing it, how they're doing it. And words that describe the act of reading and critiquing. So it's like writer meets reader. Why is the writer doing this? How's the writer receiving this? And then also words for abstract concepts and emotions. So we got these death, happiness, that's a lexical set of words. What do these tell us about the changing goals of studying English? Now, this is from, we took this data in 2019, and this was the Year 6 assessment extract from our database. So there was a text about animals and so on in China. And then there are some questions. So that was part of the assessment. And you can see a lot of it is about factual comprehension of the text. And then there's a bit about language awareness, about vocabulary. And then the section towards the bottom of the slide is a certain amount of inferencing, finding cause-effect relationships within the text. So that's the Year 6 assessment extract.
Alice, I'm sorry to
Year
interrupt.
7 task. Yeah.
Alice, I'm really sorry to interrupt. Your voice sometimes quivers a little bit. Do you mind switching off your camera to improve the quality of bandwidth?
Sure.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay, sorry. I've nearly finished now anyway. So a Year 7 English task then. How do you respond to this quote? How do fictional writers craft their text? So we can see what students are being asked to do here is rather different from what they're being asked to do in the Year 6 task there. They're being asked to respond much more critically. Critically, not in the sense of being negative, but in the sense of trying to probe feelings and the craft of writing itself. So we've got changes then from Key Stage 2 to Key Stage 3 English. Key Stage 2, comprehension, accuracy to interpretation, to understanding of effect and intention. So in Key Stage 2, the text as a fixed object that exists without question. What does it mean? What are the factual answers here? Moving up to Key Stage 3, the text that students are writing now is being presented as the result of a series of choices and decisions, and we're thinking about the interaction between the writer and the imagined reader. So what we want the students to be able to do has evolved very considerably between those Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3 assessment tasks. Okay, so implications then. And Sarah's going to mainly talk about these rather than me. So I'll just say very briefly, are word lists the answer? They're useful, I think. They're handy. I think it's useful information to have, and it's information that is not accessible in other ways. I don't think we should just give the students the word lists, because I don't think that will help particularly. For a start, without looking very carefully, we don't know exactly how the words are used and what they mean. But an important thing is that the words owe their frequency. The reason why words like reader and audience are so frequent in Key Stage 3 is to do with the function. It's to do with what we're asking students to do with that. So I think it's really important that we understand the goals of the discipline as well. And the words might not be useful without that, but they're a really useful way in at the same time. Okay, I'm going to finish there, and I believe Sarah's now going to tell us what this kind of rather academic information means for the reality, for the classroom. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for such an informative first part of this webinar. And now, in the second part, as Alice said, we now turn to Sarah for implications for supporting pupils who use EAL through those linguistic challenges that Alice was describing and explaining for us. So over to you, Sarah, when you're ready.
Yeah. Okay, how does that look?
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Okay, good. Glad that worked. Oh, thanks very much, Alice. That was so interesting. I'm a big fan of the research, and I feel like my piece will seem rather tame now, but it's what I've tried to do is to suggest some practical applications for what Alice has been saying, and filtered particularly through an EAL lens. So learners using EAL obviously face face some extra challenges. They face all the challenges that other learners might face, and then they face some extra ones. It's important to remember, of course, that they're a diverse group, but what they have in common is that they'll all face the linguistic challenges of the transition, which Alice has just spoken about, and they'll face them through a new language, through a language which is not the one that they routinely think in, operate in, speak at home. So if you can try and imagine that yourselves, that's quite a big ask, this linguistic jump in a new language. And this, of course, might have a knock-on effect on their confidence, because maybe in year 6, they were just beginning to feel like, okay, I can do this. I'm getting somewhere. I'm starting to achieve. I understand most of what the teacher says. And suddenly school changes completely and learning is splintered into lots of different little disciplinary areas, which could seem to them a bit overwhelming. On top of that, there's, of course, the range of teachers' voices, a different teacher for every subject, each with their own accent, their own idiosyncrasies of speaking, because we all have our little habits in our voices. And this could seem especially challenging to them to begin with. So what's the implications of this, and what actions can primary and secondary school take to mitigate the challenges for learners with EAL? Well, I think firstly, it's crucial that schools find some way of working together across Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3, whilst also playing their individual parts. So time needs to be made available somehow for key staff to meet and share information. Perhaps EAL specialists from secondary schools and their feeder schools could meet either in person or on Teams to share key information about the learners, the EAL transitioners who are moving from one key stage to the other. They could look at what the learner is currently able to achieve in the curriculum through English, and work out what will be challenging in year 7 and figure out some steps to meet that challenge with the learner. Also, summer learning booklets, if they exist, and lots of schools use them, I know, would benefit learners using EAL, but they might need adapting for various stages of English language acquisition. And again, perhaps EAL specialist staff from the primary and secondary schools could work on this together and be involved in developing or adapting these, and then in the case of the year 7 staff, following through in September. And then transition days, of course, are a useful slot for a bit of language work and a bit of orientation, linguistic orientation, if you like. And if possible, EAL specialists from both primary and secondary sectors could be involved in the planning and delivery of this. And we'll talk about what that might look like in a minute. So a robust English language proficiency assessment is crucial always, and it should be curriculum focused, as it's the learner's progress within the curriculum that concerns schools and which concerns the learner for their future. So if the primary school is using, for example, the Bell Foundation assessment with its associated tracker, then sharing this data with the secondary school will then enable them to monitor whether the learner is struggling to progress actually in English language, and to consider suitable classroom strategies, such as these in the Bell Foundation publication, which are linked to the assessment framework and which would help to inform teachers and ensure the best progression. So that should underpin the transition. And then thinking about primary schools in particular, although lots of what I'm going to say would equally apply, I think, to Key Stage 3, they can begin to pave the way by moving towards the kinds of tasks and language that's needed in Key Stage 3. And they can do it in quite a fun and positive way, because in my experience, learners often relish the thought of a wider range of lessons, and they're looking forward to harder, more grown-up tasks. And they're looking forward to lots of different teachers. And the suggestions here, I think, would benefit all learners, but EAL learners would particularly benefit from the homing in on these polysemic words. And I didn't know how to pronounce that word until I heard Alice say it. I've been waiting to hear her say it, so I knew how to pronounce it. So that's an indication of how hard English can be sometimes. Okay, so they'll benefit from the honing in on these difficult words, which they might find confusing, and guidance on how to interpret these in context. And then they benefit from revisiting metacognitive strategies, which would allow them to keep some kind of control of their own learning. And this will help as the school suddenly becomes physically much bigger and populated by so many different adults instead of one central teacher. It's easy to feel lost. And a good part of metacognitive strategy is developing listening skills, because as Alice said, they're going to be sitting and listening for much longer at secondary school and need to get used to a range of voices. So what might this look like? This is just one example of the different meanings that the word bar might take on in different subject areas. So have a look and you can see that you might use the word bar in a range of different subject areas. And although it always, in fact, refers to some kind of rectangular object, it does take on quite different meanings. So to anticipate this, Key Stage 2 teachers or Year 7 teams on induction day could share some examples of words like this, where the meaning might change in different areas, and do it in quite a fun way. And say, so which of these do you think belongs to music or to gymnastics or to design technology? And how can you tell? And what does the word bar mean in this context? How can you tell which subject it belongs to? And obviously one answer is if you happen to be standing in the music room looking at a piece of music, then you can be pretty sure what it refers to. But the other answer, if you're not, is the words around the word bar. So for example, in the case of music, the bar of the song. And teaching learners to recognise these collocations, or the words often used together, will help a lot with polysemy. But again, it's important to make it fun. Don't overwhelm, build on the learner's sense of excitement and anticipation, and think of what exciting things they might be doing when they encounter this word in all these different places. What are they doing when they heat a metal bar? Can you use a rope to swing up to a bar? There's a lot of positives to stress, and I think that's really important. This is just another example of how a word can have different meanings and how the context helps you to make sense of it. And for learners with using EAL, I always say focus on the words that they do understand to make sense of the ones that they don't. So move from the known to the unknown. And if you're using translators, electronic translators, for example, they can be really, really good, but it's good to translate chunks in order to get the most accurate translation of the word. Because if here you just typed in concentrate, you'd probably get the pay attention meaning, but you might actually be looking for the dehydrated fruit meaning, which is quite different. So context and chunk the language. So moving on to metacognitive strategies, the Education Endowment Foundation advises that these are best taught within the context, so involving learners in monitoring and evaluating their own learning within the context of the curriculum lessons. So for an EAL learner, metacognitive strategies are particularly important. I would say, firstly, activating prior knowledge. So to build on what's already known with the new content, always keeping the expectations and the academic challenge high. For learners using EAL, this will certainly involve being able to use their home language, because anything they already know about the subject, they quite likely learned through another language, or have talked about or read or thought about through another language. So it'll certainly involve using the home language to research, to write, to discuss, etc. Research actually found that EAL learners value having buddies and having kind teachers who'll help them. So I'm thinking learning mentors could play a key role here. Teachers can also help by sharing learning goals with learners, perhaps translating these and involving the learners in their own journey of learning and monitoring by peer and self-assessment, so that they can learn to gauge the depth of their learning and identify what they need to deepen it even further. And then finally, I think particularly important for EAL learners is plenty of opportunity to ask for support and what they should do when they get to that point where they realise they're not understanding enough to be able to make sense of things. So research indicates that learners are expected to sit and listen for longer periods in secondary school. So it's important to make sure that they've got the requisite listening skills. And this, I would say, very much applies to all learners, some listening practice can be built in late Key Stage 2, perhaps after their SATs are finished in Year 6 or on induction days. Examples of listening skills include things like listening for gist. That would mean the overall sense of something, listening for the overall sense of what something's about. And this can be particularly hard for learners using EAL at the earliest stages, because if you don't understand anything, you don't understand anything, and you don't know what it's about. You haven't got any gist. So they might benefit from some picture prompts, which will give them instant gist, if you like, and then to write down around those prompts any words at all which they recognise to try and make sense of what's being said. And then there's listening for detail, which often learners with EAL find a bit easier because it's a bit less abstract. There might be a concrete question to answer. But again, they can benefit from visuals. For example, the use of spider diagrams on which they write words around a keyword or a picture. And then finally, on the listening skills, I'll say it again, and probably not for the last time, it's really important that learners can recognise when they've not understood something enough, and learners using EAL at bands A to C need to actually rehearse and practice how to put their hand up and ask for repetition, or how to attract the attention of a teaching assistant and ask for examples. So moving on to secondary schools, secondary subject teachers, a lot of what I've just said about primary also applies to them. But secondary subject teachers also need to be mindful of polysemic words, as Alice has mentioned, because they occur across the curriculum in all kinds of different subject areas. And the challenge is always not to lower your expectations, keep the challenge high, but rather to amplify the words, to point them out. So it's as simple as just highlighting the word in context. When we talk about an expression in maths, it means this. And then a bit later on in the same lesson or the same week, we're going to make an expression. And in maths, an expression means, yeah. And maybe you might want to throw in something like, how is this different from how your art teacher might talk about the expression? You might want to throw that in just to put a bit of light and shade behind the meaning of the word. But it is simply a case, I think, of highlighting the word in context. So talking now about the complex grammar structures, this is a sentence that I lifted directly from a Key Stage 3 worksheet. And it looks at first sight fairly simple. It's not very long. I'm sure everybody that's reading it has no problems whatsoever in understanding it, but it does actually have quite a complex grammar structure in it, which is a passive voice with a modal verb. And it also has some topic-specific vocabulary here in red. And then I would hazard a guess, I would wager that word that I haven't highlighted in the middle, withstand, is a word that's quite a few Key Stage 3 learners, whether using EAL or not, might not understand. So the sentence isn't as simple as it first appears. And again, it's simply being aware of that as a teacher and amplifying it, highlighting it, and unpacking it. So for an EAL learner, this would be ideal material for any pre-teaching or intervention sessions that go on, but it can also be done within the lesson. Just look at the structure and unpack its meaning. So assuming you know the word buildings, do you know what construct means? Why have we said it like this? Why have we said be constructed? Do we know who constructs the buildings? Do we know the names of the people who built the buildings? Are they important? Are buildings always constructed to withstand tremors? Would it be good if they were? That kind of thing. And then as for the subject-specific vocabulary, I would just go for visuals. Video would work really well here because earthquake videos are always exciting. Real-life examples and then translations, but with the caveat that I mentioned before about context. So it's really just a case of the teachers being aware and of the teachers highlighting it. So thinking about metacognitive strategies, all the ones that I mentioned at primary school also apply, but moving on sort of in Key Stage 3 as learning grows and develops and skills get more abstract and more difficult, learners using EAL really benefit from modelling, from the teacher thinking aloud whilst modelling a process, because this helps the learner connect the words and the actions, the speech and the writing. Bear in mind that if you ask the learner themselves to think aloud, then for a learner with EAL, this will likely naturally happen through their first language, and this should be absolutely encouraged and celebrated. And then sharing a model of what a good one looks like, which is a waggle, so what a model answer, what you're actually trying to achieve, is a really good way of sharing goals with learners in a concrete way. It can be especially helpful for learners with EAL because they may not have completely understood from the teacher explanation to the class what they're trying to do. And it's a great way of making something which might seem quite abstract and difficult to get hold of concrete. I've got to make one that looks like that. Then another really useful skill is effective note taking. And this is, of course, an essential academic skill which will see them well through secondary school, through Key Stage 5 and beyond, if that's where they go. And so for learners with EAL, that's again about creating opportunities to make those notes in their first language. As like this, they'll make connections between all the languages that they use and the concepts and the curriculum that they're learning. And then learners using EAL need strategies to know when they need to seek clarification or support, and also how, so that they can feel proactively involved in their learning and not feel as if school is kind of something that happens around them, something that's done to them almost, but something in which they're proactively involved. And I don't know how much experience everybody has of learning foreign languages, but I'm sure everyone has a bit. There's a point when you're listening to another language where you're understanding just about enough, you're at sort of this level, you're understanding just about enough to know what's being spoken about. And that can suddenly drop and you realise you're only understanding actually one word in 5 and it's not enough to know what's being spoken about. And it's a skill, I think, for learners to realise when they're not understanding enough, and then to know how to put their hand up and ask for that kind of clarification. And that's something that, again, maybe can be done in intervention sessions if they happen, or in pre-teaching sessions with teaching assistants, or in the class with any support that's in the class. And then there was some research by Anderson et al., and it consulted EAL learners on the experience of starting new schools. And they found, first and foremost, they valued kindness from teachers and peers, but I'm not going to talk about that at length here because that's for another training, really. But they also they highly valued help developing their English language and accessing the curriculum content. They know they need to learn English and they want to learn the curriculum content. And they want help doing it. And then they valued opportunities to use their home language because they don't want to feel that they have to reinvent themselves just because they've started a new school. So my last few slides now, I'm just going to look at how we might unpack this in the light of the research that Alice has shared with us. So I would say that effective support for EAL always starts with skilled up teachers. And CPD, whole school CPD, is great, and we offer a nice range of it at the Bell Foundation, but it is more time consuming, often more expensive, sometimes more difficult to arrange. So short burst CPD, such as sending round an EAL tip of the week or sharing a single support strategy in a weekly staff briefing and talking briefly about how you might use that in your subject area, can be really highly effective in a kind of macro learning sort of way. Another effective form of CPD, which is practical, is EAL surgeries, where subject teachers bring along modules of work or upcoming activities and say, I've got to teach this to a class that's got this kid and this kid and this kid in it, and I'm not sure that they're going to access it. What should I do? And the EAL specialist suggests ways in which it could be adapted. A variation on this is an EAL working party within a department, maybe, where teachers and specialists can look at a whole scheme of work together. And leading on from that, often coming out of that, is the wonderful idea of EAL champions, where a mainstream teacher in each department takes on the mantle of EAL champion and takes it upon themselves to maybe model EAL strategies in their lessons. So they might say, come along on Thursday period 4 and watch me using a dictogloss to introduce genetic variation, for example. And teachers from that science department can go along and see how that works. I found that, in my experience, to be one of the most effective forms of CPD. And then effective collaboration between subject teachers and EAL specialists can also help to build suitable scaffolding into lessons. Bearing in mind the double job which EAL learners are doing, they're learning new curriculum content and they're simultaneously learning a new language via that content, then a degree of scaffolding is necessary to help them. And so things like graphic organisers, such as fishbone diagrams or Venn diagrams, can help learners to organise their thoughts. They can help with those abstract concepts, making them more concrete by grounding them in a diagram. And they can help to plan speaking, and they can help to plan writing as well. But I think they're very good for grounding those abstract concepts. And then substitution tables are great for practicing key grammatical structures. We looked at passive voice earlier. That would lend itself really well to a substitution table. There are lots of examples on the Bell Foundation website of all of these things. And this scaffold could then, the substitution table, can easily then be reduced to a sentence stem where learners just have the beginning of a sentence like buildings can be, and they finish the whole sentence themselves there by using the structure. And then for vocabulary, Phil, for example, is a great way of using new vocabulary in context. You have the contents, you have the sentences in which it's going to be used, and you have the words to fit in the gaps. So what I'm saying then is that by working together, subjects and EAL specialists can ensure that the learner with EAL is able to progress linguistically at the same time as academically. And my final slide, although I think it does finish rather abruptly really, but my final slide still about the collaboration between EAL specialists and subject specialists is still looking at the curriculum focused support. And we're looking at things like homework clubs, which if they're run by EAL specialists can help the learner access some support. They can also help build those metacognitive strategies because they're playing a proactive role in their own learning by identifying where they need clarification and where they go to get it. They also help keep the EAL staff abreast of what challenges are presenting themselves across the curriculum. And this can then in turn help inform their work with different subject teachers and departments. Then subject surgeries, which are run by mainstream departments. The last school I worked in some years ago, the head of science used to run a surgery at the end of every module where learners from that year group could go along and have clarification on anything they hadn't understood in that module. And EAL staff in attendance at that would be really helpful and lead to good collaborative work. And then finally, pre-teaching sessions where before they encounter a new structure, a new concept, a new piece of grammar, a new set of vocab, they can be familiarised with them, maybe with an EAL specialist or with a teaching assistant. They can be familiarised with key vocabulary and concepts so that they've got something to build on in the lessons and they're not hit with it in a sort of blind panic when they first see it on the board or hear it. So again, we're strengthening those metacognitive strategies through proactive planning and preparation for learning. And that's me.
Thank you so much, Sarah. We have very little time left, so I'm just going to pick one question for each of you, and can I ask you to answer it as briefly as you can? So one question for Alice. How do the words you showed in Key Stages 2 and 3 relate to the Common European Framework levels? And does the Common European Framework level correlate with the Key Stages levels?
To the best of my knowledge, there isn't an explicit correlation between the two ways of measuring words. And I haven't tried to measure those across. So I don't believe that they have been matched at all. The complication with polysemy, of course, means that knowing a word isn't just a matter of knowing that word, it's knowing the relevant meaning of that word. So no, I'm afraid, as far as I'm aware, there isn't any technical correlation there.
Thank you. And a question from Mary for Sarah. Sarah, when does translation become a problem? Sometimes the learners don't think past unknown words and are not resilient around new vocabulary. It may slow them down, or maybe they don't know the word in the first language. Thoughts, please.
I think it can be true sometimes that learners don't know the word in their first language if it's, well, maybe they've had disrupted schooling in their first language, or maybe it's just a case that the curriculum's moved on and it's a word that they wouldn't hear spoken around the dinner table, for example. So then I think it's a case of finding another word or phrase to explain that word in English, and then maybe relating that to the first language so they can build on what they already know. I wouldn't argue myself that the first language ever slows anyone down. I think quite the opposite. I think it's essential part of their learning toolbox, if you like.
Thank you very much. So this brings us to the end of our webinar. Before we finish, can I just let you know of some resources and training opportunities that we have coming up? So Lizzie, if you can very briefly, thank you very much. So we've got forthcoming courses coming up for 2024. The first one is Leading a Whole School Strategy for EAL. This course starts on the 16th of January, and it's more for EAL coordinators and leaders. And then the second course is Introduction to EAL Assessment. So we show you and we give you an understanding of how to use the EAL assessment framework for schools to assess the proficiency in English of children with English as an additional language. Can I just say that we will have more webinars in the next year, but this is the end of our webinar program for this year. So please go to our website and visit and look for forthcoming webinars at the beginning of the next academic year. We will have more information at the beginning of January for you. Finally, a quick reminder that you will get an email tomorrow with a link to the video recording of this webinar, and that when you leave the webinar, a post-webinar evaluation form will appear, and you will also get a link to the same form in the email tomorrow. Please, 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 we'll be very grateful if you can spend a few moments to complete it, because your views really matter, because they help us shape our future webinar program. Thank you very much for taking part in today's webinar, and a very, very special thank you to Alice and to Sarah for sharing such useful insights. The feedback on the chat is really very good, so thank you so much. We look forward to seeing you all again in the new year, and until we meet virtually again, have a fantastic break, and goodbye from all of us at the Bell Foundation. Goodbye.
Bye.